Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, April 9th, day 551 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our legal reporter, Jeremy Sharon. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning. We are here to discuss the mass chaos in the High Court yesterday that came during an 11-hour hearing on petitions filed against the firing of Shin Bet head Ronen Bar. Jeremy will fill us in, of course, on the court's ruling, which concentrated actually on procedural flaws and not the idea that he could be fired or not. And we'll take a few steps back and put everything into context of the judicial overhaul that has been going on since the start of this government. And in the second half of the program, Jeremy will don his settlements hat and we'll hear about a really interesting gift that the government gave to several illegal outposts in the West Bank. All this and more when we're back. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife Sarah landed back at Ben Gurion Airport this morning. The premier, of course, departed Israel for Hungary last week on Wednesday, and from there continued on to Washington, D.C., where he met with several figures, including President Donald Trump. Netanyahu landed at the airport, and he's due to arrive at Tel Aviv District Court later on today to give testimony in his ongoing criminal trial. Watch this space for updates, right, Jeremy?
Indeed.
Now let's turn to the chaos in the High Court yesterday. And yesterday, the High Court of Justice issued an interim injunction stating that Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar must remain in office until further notice and giving the government and the Attorney General until April 20th to reach a compromise over the legal dispute surrounding the unprecedented vote last month to fire Ronen Bar. So this is a temporary move and not the end to this much contested wild ride following the Prime Minister's decision to fire Bar and his cabinet's approval. So let's set the scene, Jeremy, and talk about the big, there's no other word for it than balagan yesterday in the court. And then we'll come back to the issues at hand. So set the scene for us, Jeremy.
Sure. As you said, a massive balagan, a huge uproar, and as a lot of people talked about it, described it, just chaos in the court. The hearing got underway, and then after a couple of minutes, there starts yelling from the crowd. That includes a man who lost his son, who was fighting as a soldier in Gaza during the war. There was yells from a particularly vociferous member of the Knesset, that's Tali Gottlieb from the Likud party. And basically, the judges, they realized that they couldn't conduct the hearing in this way because the audience just simply wasn't letting them. And at one stage, the audience started breaking into cries of shame, 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 and you don't have the authority. And that was referencing their perspective that the court doesn't even have the authority to rule on this issue of whether Ronen Bar could be fired or not. And you had this clamor and uproar in the courtroom. And the judges decided they couldn't carry on. And so they left to decide what to do. Outside the courtroom, there was a similar, uproar and jostling and shouting, mutual recriminations between, both sides of this argument, of the broader debate in Israel over the rule of law versus the rule of the government. And we'll get into that shortly. But really, it was, as you said, it was unprecedented. And I think the Supreme Court President Yitzhak Amit, he said it was unprecedented, and he called the fact that the proceedings had to stop. He said that was a very severe incident, and he also protested against MK Tali Gottlieb's behavior, who was one of the prominent reasons why the court had to stop its proceedings, because she simply would not stop yelling. And he said it's outrageous that the legislative branch is interfering with the proceedings of the judicial branch. So we kind of had in this courtroom a microcosm of the entire societal, political, ideological divide that we've seen in this country over the past few years. And I think I would say it was disturbing and unsettling and saddening.
What is also remarkable about this particular member of Knesset is that she is, of course, a lawyer herself and has been in that room as a lawyer on several occasions. So, yes, you started to mention this is basically a clash between several different parts of society. And this case was brought by several petitioners who are petitioning against the firing of Ronen Bar. So, just to frame it a little bit, we have the petitioners and then we have the Netanyahu supporters, essentially. These are the two sides. And on the one hand, the petitioners are saying that Ronen Bar is being fired for personal and political motivations. So they're talking about Barr's investigation into Qatargate, his public declaration that there should be a state commission of inquiry into October 7th, not just the IDF probes that we've been discussing. And we heard also in a letter on Friday that Netanyahu allegedly requested that Bar persuade the court presiding over his corruption trial to postpone his testimony. Lots of stuff flying around here. And then on the other side, we have the Netanyahu supporters who, as we've been talking about since the government essentially was sworn in, that they see a real intervention into the government's decisions by the judiciary, and the legal establishment is trying to constrain the right-wing government. Okay, so we have a bit of a framing here. So, Jeremy, what was interesting to note in your analysis, however, is that the judges, being judges, aren't talking about the philosophical issues at hand. They're talking more about procedural concerns. So let's talk about the procedural concerns that were picked up on yesterday.
Sure. So, as you said, the judges focused on those procedural concerns, I think to an extent because the claims that there's a conflict of interest for Netanyahu to fire Bar because of the Qatargate investigation might not be on the strongest grounds. Netanyahu isn't a suspect in that investigation. And I think there's, proving that there was ulterior motives in firing Bar is also difficult. So I think the judges wanted to focus specifically on the procedural problems, especially because that's what the Attorney General flagged up before the government fired Ronen Bar. And I think it's critical to point out at this point that the Attorney General never told the government they couldn't fire Ronen Bar. But this country has never fired the head of the Shin Bet and has never fired any of the 7 major office holders, civil servant, senior positions. And so the Attorney General was telling the government, you have to do this properly. This has never happened before. Let's make sure we do it by the book and uphold good governance, proper administrative process, and the rule of law. And the government just went ahead and blew past that and did it in fired Ronen Bar in a very alacritous and hasty manner, which is what the court pointed out. And I think, by the way, focusing on the procedural issues slightly helps the court in that those procedural issues might be able to be remedied. And we'll talk about that later. Whereas the conflict of interest aspect, if they get into the weeds in that, then that might really cause a clash, which they can't avoid. And as I said, proving those issues of conflict of interest and ulterior motives is more difficult, so they're focused on the procedural issues. What those procedural issues were, on the March 15th, Netanyahu told or announced that he was going to fire Ronen Bar. Just a few days later, I think on the 19th, Ronen Bar got a WhatsApp message summoning him to a hearing with the government. And in that hearing, before that hearing, he wasn't given a detailed list of what he'd done wrong and what the, actual proper cause was for firing him. It's just some vague ideas that the government had lost its faith and trust in him. And there was other procedural problems as well. But that was, and I think principally one of the other principal procedural problem which we should talk about is the fact that the Attorney General told the government before it fired him that they have to consult with this advisory committee which appoints those 7 senior civil servant office holders. And the government just ignored the Attorney General and blew past that as well. And lo and behold, on March 20th, they held the hearing. Ronen Bar himself said, there's no proper accusations against me. I can't respond to these charges, so there's no point me turning up for the hearing. So he didn't turn up for the hearing. The government talked about it for a few hours, and then in the early hours of the morning, fired Ronen Bar. And those are the procedural problems which the court really had an issue with. And it was notable that during the hearing, Supreme Court President Yitzhak Hamid said, I think the Attorney General was right to tell the government to consult with the advisory committee. And that appears to be one of the major issues which the court had, along with the other procedural issues which we've discussed.
So it just astounds me in a way that the government would leapfrog over this procedural issue, because it was so known ahead of time that this is on the books, that they're meant to be doing this. And the Attorney General, of course, advised them to do this. And so you just have to wonder, again, so many of our members of Knesset are lawyers themselves, including in the Netanyahu cabinet. And you have to wonder, why would they do that? It just sounds to me that they're trying to position this fight, this clash of cultures. Would you agree with that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And that's really kind of the what I tried to explain in my analysis, which I posted last night. I think this whole issue over Ronen Bar reflects, the pre-October 7th division over the government's ability to rule versus the restraints on its power that other parts of the country think is important that remain, and that there is a check to government power. Basically, I framed it as the rule of law versus the rule of the majority. And we thought the October 7th attacks would heal this whole divide, but actually I think it's just magnified it and raised it up further when you get to issues like what happened, in court with Ronen Bar, and the audience shouting to the court, you don't have the authority to rule on this. That's the whole argument here. So, you said, well, why did the government ministers and MKs, go along with this? It's because they are of the opinion, and they repeat it over and over and again. If you talk, whether it's Justice Minister Levin or Communications Minister Shlomo Kari, all of them, they all talk about the people will decide. That is their most favorite expression. The people will decide. The people will not be silenced. And I was seeing those messages being sent on WhatsApp via, from the spokespeople of these ministers and other MKs throughout the course of the day. The people will not be silenced. And they, actually supporting the protesters shutting down the proceedings. So what I'm trying to say is that the Attorney General, on the other hand, her entire, battle with this government has been, for the longest time, over her insistence that the rule of law be followed. Again, she never told the government they couldn't fire Ronen Bar. She said it just has to be done in the right way. And, why is that important? Because what she's saying is like, this country must be run in accordance with the rule of law. However, in whatever direction it is taken, it must be run in accordance with the rule of law and within the boundaries of the law. Otherwise, will we descend into, essentially a banana republic? And that I saw a comment by a constitutional scholar, Susie Navot, and she said, what happens if we allow, or if the court, the judicial system would allow, this poor process for firing Ronen Bar to go through? What does that say about the other, major office holders? How does that impact the way the government could deal with firing the IDF chief of staff, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Bank of Israel, all of these, senior civil servants which have real power, real importance for the way the country is run? If the government is allowed to simply dismiss them and in this kind of alacritous and hasty manner, then perhaps we really will begin to lose the advantages of a democracy in the way that democracies are run in an orderly manner, in a way which is transparent, and in a way which essentially allows the country to follow norms, to follow rules, and to be governed in a transparent manner, without which there's an opening there for corruption and for the deterioration of the quality of government and the quality of society. And I think, as I said, that's really encapsulates this Ronen Bar issue encapsulates that whole argument. And I think that's why it's raised the passions so much on both sides, because again, the passions on the right wing about the government being able to rule without being restrained or without having the judiciary trespass on its authority. I think that's also those are very, very real concerns and very heartfelt concerns. And that's why we've seen such tumult over this Ronen Bar issue.
Let's go to a short break and continue discussing this. And we're back. 31% of Israelis, including 36% of Jews, believe that the government should disregard the High Court of Justice if it reverses the dismissal of Ronen Bar. That's according to a poll published by the Israel Democracy Institute yesterday. Of course, right now we're not at a point in which the dismissal has been reversed. We're at an injunction, which is a temporary measure, and it appears that the court is trying to reach some kind of compromise position. So, Jeremy, let's end out our discussion on this topic about the compromise position that was proposed essentially by Justice Noam Sohlberg.
Yeah, so I think I said in a previous analysis that the court was slightly anxious to get involved in this because of the political nature of the issue. And were it to rule against the government completely and strike down the decision, I think that would cause chaos. And we've seen before yesterday's ruling, the justice minister threatened to basically ignore the ruling and ignore Ronen Bar if he was kept in office in order to force him out. After the ruling, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said that he said something similar, we should just ignore him. There is like a chance of a constitutional crisis where one branch of the government refuses to listen to the other. So that's why Sohlberg, who's the most conservative judge on the panel, suggested the two sides should find a way to come to agreement. And his suggestion was bring the issue to the advisory panel, as the Attorney General previously said. Then the government can present its arguments why it's lost trust in Ronen Bar, and that should remedy the procedural flaws of the original decision. How the two sides, the Attorney General's office and the government, decide to work out how to adjudicate this issue, it remains to be seen. But there is a chance that it can be done amicably, that the procedural flaws would be remedied to satisfy the Attorney General, to satisfy the court, if not to satisfy the petitioners. And therefore, and that would ameliorate those concerns about the lack of, violating the rule of law and descending down to a path of, administrative anarchy. So that chance is there to resolve this issue in that way. We have to wait and see what the two sides decide. They have till after Pesach, till after Passover to make that decision.
Acharei Chagim, right, Jeremy?
Always.
So let's end the program with a story about how Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and Settlements and National Missions Minister Orit Struk participated in a ceremony last week in which 19 all-terrain vehicles, ATVs, that were paid for with state funds were granted to illegal settlements, basically farming outposts in southern Hebron Hills region. So they were granted for security purposes. And just to remind our listeners, this is the area, of course, or one of the areas, of course, in which many extremist settlers are at least accused of attacking Palestinians, often Bedouin, who are living in this area. So, Jeremy, what do you make of this gift for quote-unquote security purposes to these settler outposts?
I think first and foremost, it shows just how comfortable this current government is with seeking to advance the settlement movement in general and to promote further settlement construction, and specifically relating to the farming outposts, to the goal of taking control of as much land in Area C of the West Bank as possible. That's really the specific goal of these farming outposts, because basically what happens is a shepherd will take his flock and graze over many thousands of dunams of land, and in that way assert control. That's the real focus here. And I think the fact that to do this action in public so brazenly, it really reflects the government's position that no one is challenging it on this issue, and it really can do almost what it likes at present. So as I said, the ceremony was giving ATVs, all-terrain vehicles, to people who have set up these illegal outposts, meaning they haven't got authorization from the government. And as you mentioned, a lot of these settlements are often accused of being involved in violence against Palestinians. The settlement where this ceremony took place, it was called Interim Farm, is very close to a Palestinian village called Shin Bet, which I've been to several times and reported on numerous times, which was depopulated because of settler violence, specifically by the owner of Interim Farm. His name is Inon Levi, and he's been mentioned numerous times in motions to the High Court asking the police and the IDF to defend Shin Bet, and he's been cited as the person who's involved in attacking the residents, destroying their solar panels, destroying their water infrastructure. And we've even seen footage of Inon Levi on an ATV vehicle harassing Palestinian sheep and the shepherds herding their flocks. And that is actually a common accusation made against the extremist settlers, that they use ATVs and drones to harass flocks and unsettle them. And the government is handing out these ATVs to the owners of these illegal outposts. So I think it's something which is can only happen under the current circumstances, especially under the current US administration. And I think it's worrying. And I also don't think we'll see the last of these ATVs because I imagine they'll pop up in the videos of pro-Palestinian activists in the region. I hope not, but my suspicion is that that's what will happen. And if they're used not for the security purposes that they were designed for.
Or at least not what they're designed for, but perhaps what they were purchased for in the construct of everything, putting everything all together. Okay, Jeremy, thank you so much for bringing that story and for explaining what the heck happened yesterday in the High Court. And of course, we will have more updates on all issues. Please watch our live blog for that. Jeremy, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for watching and listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.